And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to come and share before you on this Sabbath morning. And as has been mentioned, my name is Bill Probasco. I'm the conference president this year, and I'm from the Seventh-day Baptist Church in Shiloh, New Jersey. Anyway, my wife Valerie has come with me. I've jokingly called her my chief of staff, and very much so. She is there for me. As I was saying, my wife Valerie has come with me, my chief of staff. She does travel around with me to several of these stops I've gone on. And we have two children, my daughter Holly. Our daughter Holly is 13, soon to be 14, and Liam is 11. And one of those pictures, of course, I think you can guess where we were. The second one is actually last year on our way out to General Conference in Minnesota. We had stopped off in Ohio and took a picture. So that's warmer weather indeed. So when I was asked to serve as conference president, my wife and I did discuss possible venues and places to come and visit various churches throughout the denomination, and did know that we have a vibrant young church growing in Cumberland, Maryland, and that's not too far away. So we hoped we might have the opportunity to come and visit. So it's a pleasure to be here. Now, my main purpose as the president of conference is to develop the theme for conference and to travel around to different churches and associations and talk about that theme. So I look forward to maybe sharing a little later today on some of the fun activities planned for conference. For those of you that may not be aware, conference is in Lancaster at the Bible College, not that far away. So hopefully you can be encouraged to come out this July. Well, right now I'd like to share on my theme, and my theme for the coming year, as many of you have probably heard, is Steadfast. Now, I'm not sure why God gave me that as my theme. I'm not usually one who has God audibly speak to me. But on this occasion he did. When I was asked at conference 2 years ago if I'd be willing to serve as the upcoming president, almost immediately I had this word steadfast in my mind. I had to wonder, what does being steadfast mean? I had an idea, but you always want to double check a definition. So its definition is to be loyal or stand firm on something. So if you're steadfast, you're steadily holding on to a belief, to a position, to a choice you've made. And I think everyone is steadfast about something. I enjoy bike riding. My friends say I'm a steadfast bike rider. I like to get out and exercise. That's my way of unwinding and relaxing. With my hectic schedule, the long winter, I have not had the opportunity to be quite as steadfast as maybe I would like, but it's still something I like to do, and when I get the opportunity, I go out on my bike rides. My wife will be coming home from work, will call me. If I get home before her, she says, "Where are you?" I said, "Well, I'm out on the road," because, of course, now with a cell phone, you can catch anybody anywhere. But that's what I like to do. Those that know me know that I'm a steadfast fan for a particular football team, and I have followed them for many years. Now, right now, they're having a good run, but I've been I've been a fan for over 30 years. I've been through a 2-14 season. I've been through 20 years where they didn't win a playoff game. Going through that stretch, you become a steadfast fan, or you find a new team. That's how that works. I love history. I like to visit presidential sites, whether it be libraries, houses they've lived in, or even grave sites. You could argue that I'm steadfast in my desire to seek out these places. Just ask my kids. I have visited the only Pennsylvania president whose birth and death site is nearby. Now, there's no native Marylanders, but I figured the closest we could get would be a highly regarded Pennsylvania president. Does anybody know who that might be? That's James Buchanan, who had the unfortunate record of being in office when the Civil War actually started. So unfortunately, he's probably not that highly thought of amongst some historians. My kids, being as wonderful as they are, bought me an app for my phone to help me locate these presidential sites wherever I travel. Lucky them. I have actually overstayed and overvisited these places, and here my son is refusing to get out of the van and go to yet another site. So I guess maybe you can be overly steadfast at times. So I've learned a lot about our past leaders of this country through my reading and through my travels. Some overcame much, others seemed destined for the position. Still others may be questionable why they were where they were. Now my sermon title today is, Has Your Time Passed to Be Steadfast? And it brings to mind one obscure president. How many have ever even heard of President Chester Arthur? A couple hands, very good, very good. He served 1881 to 85. Very personable when I met him. Larger than life. I actually did meet him. I stopped by his place. I introduced the kids. You get the idea of what I do to my children, so pray for them perhaps. Well, without making this into a full-blown history lecture, let me give you the Reader's Digest version. In the 1880s, in the 1800s, it was commonplace that with each new president, nearly all the government jobs were given out to supporters and friends of the president. It's a term called patronage. Still hear that today. Patronage, yes. You didn't need experience in international trade to be a tariff collector, just experience palling around with the senator. It was connections and not qualifications that mattered. Trouble with patronage is once they were out of office, you were out of the job. Enter Chester Chet Arthur. Following the Civil War, he became a close friend of a senator from New York named Russell Conkling. And that senator had a lot of power. And he used it to put his people in the positions he wanted. He pulled strings and put Chester Arthur in as the head of the Port of New York. Now, without getting too complicated on you, that's a very lucrative job in the 1870s because almost all the international trade in the United States would come through the Port of New York. By 1878, the current president, Rutherford B. Hayes, grew tired of this patronage and had Arthur fired for being unqualified. Who'd have thought? He really didn't have any qualifications. It was the only position he ever held where it was a public position, and he had been slid in there as one of the cronies of this powerful senator. Well, 2 years later, it's time for a new presidential election, and James Garfield is nominated to be the president. Well, as a nod to this very powerful senator from New York, they nominate Chester Arthur to be vice president. Imagine that. He'd just been fired from a job for being unqualified, but he could be vice president. Well, the Garfield-Arthur ticket wins. For weeks after the inauguration, the new president is expected to meet with job seekers to fill these patronage positions. There's stories told of Thomas Jefferson answering the door to the White House with slippers on to greet people seeking jobs within the federal government. Anyway, you get the idea that anybody who helped out in the campaign in any small way would come looking for a job. And they did by the thousands. The president had to meet and greet all these people coming through. And as you can imagine, this does not screen out the undesirables, the unqualified, even the mentally ill. And one such man named Charles Guiteau felt in his mind he had campaigned so hard for the Garfield-Arthur ticket that he deserved to be an ambassador. He was unfortunately mentally unstable and came several times to the White House, each time being turned down. Well, finally, he grew so frustrated, he shoots the president, President Garfield, in the back, and Garfield dies from the attack 3 months later. Modern medicine, it wasn't. The reason Guiteau gave was that now that Chester Arthur was president, maybe he'd finally get one of the jobs he deserved. What was poor Chet Arthur to do? Well, the belief was he was going to start handing out jobs to all of his men because that's how he got where he was. In fact, I searched on Google presidential patronage, and this is one of the first images that comes up. That's Chet Arthur handing out all his jobs to all his cronies. 150 years later, that's the symbol for presidential patronage, because that's what people thought. To everyone's amazement, President Arthur set out to do what Port Collector Arthur would never have done. He set out to reform the patronage system. No one else was ever going to rise through the system the way he had, with a slap on the back. By the time his administration ended, journalists were writing, "No man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted as Chester Alan Arthur, and no one ever retired more generally respected by friend or foe." Chester Arthur had reached a watershed moment in his life, and he acted on it. Not for glory or personal gain for a change, but because it was the right thing to do. He saw his time had not passed to become steadfast. Had he always been steadfast? Certainly not. He could have easily said, "I'm not the right person for the job." But something happened, something dramatic, and it changed his life forever. Something that would make him steadfast in a cause. You know, something happened, something dramatic on the road to Damascus. You see, a Pharisee named Saul set out to round up some Jewish heretics and cart them off to jail. But a great light encircled him, and his whole life began to change. He was asked a simple question we read about in the book of Acts. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And that question changed his life forever. Something that would make Saul steadfast in a cause. And that cause was spreading the gospel everywhere he could. He certainly hadn't started out with this as his plan. In fact, he started out dragging Christians off to prison or watching them get stoned in the case of Stephen. After encountering Christ on the road to Damascus, he could have followed Christ and yet said, "I'm not the right person to reach out to the Gentiles. I mean, think of my history." But he didn't. Now, I can't say that I've had the same dramatic event occur in my life that Saul did, nor have I reached the lofty title of conference president at my predecessor's expense, thankfully. But when I was 17 years old, I was in a car accident, and I was lucky to walk away from it. I think of your experience this week, how close that could be. I know others that have had similar accidents that were gravely injured or even killed. I felt God had a purpose for me with my life. And now I can't say that I've always been the perfect Christian since then. Most people can't. But I have tried to be steadfast, the purpose of sharing with others the love of God, whether that's at work or when I was in school or amongst my friends. I coach basketball. I've done this now every winter since I've been married. Our church has a basketball league. The interesting thing is, the only rule for being able to play is attending church, Sabbath school, or youth group. You don't even have to dribble a ball, and many of them can't. Let me just say as a coach. Now, this is a steadfast commitment our church has made and that I've made to reach the youth at church. Now, I'm sure my wife doesn't appreciate losing every Saturday night during the winter, but she respects me and supports me in that. Now, my daughter plays too. She's the one up front there, the blondie at the top. So I guess my wife's kind of stuck coming out, whether she likes it or not. Now, I could walk away from this commitment, but I don't. Even years when we don't win a single game, like this past year. I know for some of these girls, their commitment to the basketball team is the only thing that ties them to our church or youth group. And maybe that's an unfortunate statement on their commitment, but it's a start. Maybe it's a seed I can help to plant that one day saves their soul. God calls us to be steadfast in our faith. And you can't be steadfast without being invested. I coach because I enjoy it. I feel if I didn't enjoy it, and some seasons are harder than others, the girls would quickly realize that it didn't really matter to me, and I was not invested. Either way you look at it, the thing about being steadfast is you have to have some commitment, some investment. Now, if I say I'm going to be steadfast about Maryland history, now I'm here in Maryland, you can tell pretty quickly whether I'm really invested in it or not. Maybe I'm able to identify a few things. There's, Fort McHenry, there's Ocean City, Cal Ripken Jr., but I really don't necessarily know much about the history of the state. If these things were really important to me, I would be invested. I'd be able to talk about how the colony was an early Catholic haven, how it's a key border state during the Civil War, how the Mason-Dixon line runs just a few miles from this very spot. If it means something in my life, you can tell pretty quickly. And that goes for our churches as well. Those churches that are strong and growing are invested. What are they invested in? Jesus Christ. How does one know? I think you can tell. God is working in those churches, and those churches are working for God. Now, I thought, how could I see if the Full Gospel SDB Church is invested? How many of you know what a vanity search is? If you go online and type your name in and search and see what comes up, that's considered a vanity search. So I did a little vanity search for you. What did I find? I find a church, bold and bright, pastor leading the flock, a congregation ministering to others, a servant of God on fire for church growth, youth performing Christmas plays. I think that's great. It shows an invested church sits here in the mountains of Western Maryland. A steadfast church looking to grow. As I said, when you're invested, you're steadfast in what you do. And when you're invested in God, you trust in Him. We read in Jeremiah, "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and whose trust is the Lord. For he will be like a tree planted by the water, that extends its roots by a stream, and will not fear when heat comes. But its leaves will be green, and it will not be anxious in a year of drought, nor cease to yield fruit." Now in the verses preceding this, it talks about the man who trusts in man. That man is like the heath of the desert, inhabiting parched places. You can picture these snapping off and rolling through the ghost towns, somewhere in the Wild West. Heath is a scrub-like plant, and it's an obvious contrast to the man who trusts in God and is a well-watered tree. That's where my logo comes in. You see the river flowing by this grand tree. I think God gave me a mental image of a strong tree planted by the river, and there's scriptures to back that up. This tree that is steadfast. It stands firm against rain, storms, tremors. Now thinking back to my examples, President Arthur met a lot of resistance, but pushed through a change in policy that bore fruits for decades. Saul had a lot of doubters in his change. But I doubt we'd have a New Testament if not for his efforts through the Lord. And on a much less grand scale, I know that even when my basketball team can't even seem to dribble the basketball, I'm still able to pray with them at practice and before games and hopefully plant that seed of faith in them. It took President Arthur being thrust into a position to take action so that what happened to him and President Garfield hopefully wouldn't happen again. It took Saul an encounter on the road to Damascus on his way to arrest more Christians to make him steadfast. They became steady and firm, invested in what they were doing. Maybe they weren't before, but they became so. God dramatically entered their lives well down a road some might think you could not turn back from. But God allows U-turns. Are you running down the wrong road? Doesn't matter. God is so steadfast, so invested in each one of us that we don't need to be perfect. God allows us to turn around. God allows K-turns. God allows us to back up. And God will allow us to turn the car off and walk if that's what it's going to take to get us going in the right direction. God has such steadfast love for His children, He wants us all to experience it. And it's never, ever too late to do so. So, share that love in a steadfast way and thank somebody for doing what they do. Show that you are invested in them like God is in you. Thank somebody for what they do today, even if you don't know that person or know them very well. Maybe leaving church today. Thank somebody for working with the children's ministry, for teaching a Sabbath school class or a Bible school as you were growing up, even for preaching every week or just coming out and fellowshipping. A little bit goes a long way. Think back to my logo about the tree planted by the waterside. When you're surrounded by other trees, the wind outside doesn't seem as bad. See, God plants forests, not one-tree hills. Because actually He did that, didn't He? 2,000 years ago. There was a tree on a hill, and His Son was nailed to it for us. Nothing more than that can show investment of God's steadfast love for us. Because of that one tree upon which Christ was nailed, we're stronger. Last year's conference president had as his theme, choose. I think that's still our theme. Let's choose to be steadfast. And I hope to see you at Lancaster